Hi, my name's Russell Spatz. I'm an alcoholic. You know, I'm 77 years old, and I'm in my 46th year of sobriety, and it's good to be here. I like this place. I like you guys. I don't even know you, which is probably why I like you. But anyway, I don't know where the chickens are. I'm sure. I don't think it's my fault. I nearly told Colonel Sam just drop by my stepstairs, and I know him. You know, I'm glad I had nothing to do. He may have misunderstood me. So we're going to talk sort of like about the third. This is like Pulp Fiction. You guys seen Pulp Fiction? You know, like it starts at the end or the middle and goes backwards and forwards, and somehow when the movie's over, you sort of get it. You know what I mean? And because I'm not that, I got the dementia thing going on, and some people sort of laugh at that. I think it's a joke, but it's true. I can't. You know, I'm 77. I can't remember things. I'll like in the morning. I'll sort of think briefly about what I think I'm going to say, and it's brilliant. And I have this entire meeting in my mind. I said, man, that's the greatest freaking meeting I've ever done in my life. And then I forget whatever. I'll think about something right now. So I ought to start out with that. Then I forget it. You know, so it's you know, that used to be it's really not scary because I don't know. I had that thing happen to me. You know, that thing in the big book that says you lose fear of people and of economic insecurity, not because I'm rich, just because it doesn't bother you anymore. And so that's a good thing because I don't talk about the drinking thing. I figure you guys all know about the drinking thing. You've probably been to a million meetings, but they say don't drink, go to meetings, all that drinking stuff. I don't do that because that's not really a problem. Nobody here has a problem with drinking. You know, if you think you have a problem with drinking, you're wrong. I'm just telling you, you're dead wrong. But you don't have to believe anything I say. You know, I say a lot of stupid stuff like that. You know, and I'm really not that. I have a lot of degrees and diplomas that sort of allow me to hide the fact that I'm not really that well. But the truth of the matter is, I can tell you this: I'm going to be truthful with you. I'm going to be direct with you. I'm not going to filter. Well, I might filter a few things. You know. I might not say the F-bomb so much, you know, or something. I might filter that kind of stuff, but I'm going to really tell you as it is because, you know, I want people to tell me as what it's like, you know, and what actually happened and what it's like now. And I used to, one of the things I did, which I think saved my life, and not because I was smart, but one of the things I did is growing up in AA is I would follow these guys around. You know, like the Joe Snyders and the Clancys and all these guys, and the Johnny Harrises and all these guys, circuit speakers, and I follow them around because I don't know what it is. I get bored easily, and I need to hear new shit. You know what I mean? I mean, it's important early on when you're in AA to hear all the old stuff that's repeated over and over again. There's nothing wrong with repeating. Don't drink and go to meetings. Don't drink if your ass falls off. All the stuff they say with that not drinking thing, because this is like a giant. It's like a one-room schoolhouse. We got guys with 40 years, with 30 years, with 25 years, and all sorts of stuff that have done the steps, that haven't done the steps, that believe in God, people don't believe in God, God with 2 days, God with 5 minutes, and everything like that. We all meet at the same place, you know, and that's the deal. So I don't sort of conform myself to what I think you'll like or what he'll like. I figure the best just who knows, you know what I mean? I don't even know. I may say something about God, and the guy with 15 years will get pissed off, and the guy with 1 day will say that's what I wanted to hear. You know, I mean, so you don't try to. But if you're scared, you know what I mean? If you're scared of people whether they like you or not, which is basically the true alcoholism. I used to tell everybody in the bar, or even when I wasn't drinking, I don't give a shit about what they think about me. But as I've learned, and as I now know, people that tell themselves they don't care what other people think about them, all they do is worry about what other people think about them. They spend money they don't have to buy shit they don't need to impress people they don't like. You know, they're constantly comparing themselves with other people. All they do is think about, you know, I wonder what, you know, they don't raise their hands at meetings, they don't share because they're worried about, you know, the fear stuff. That's the true alcoholism, and the book backs that up. I think you can go for many years being sober without really understanding what the book's actually saying. Not because we're stupid, it's just because we just don't get it. So the more I'm in AA, the more I pay attention to sentences, not paragraphs. Because there's so many paragraphs. I'm a lawyer. So what happens is I know how to find the loophole. So if I don't like something, I don't look at that. If I like something, I'll look at that. You know what I mean? So I start paying attention to the sentences, like there is one who has all power. I pay attention to that sentence. What does that mean? That one is godly, fundamental. What does that mean? Burn the idea into every outpost. I pay attention to the sentences that are in the book. I pay attention to a lot of I just look at the sentences. What does that mean? And if you look at the sentences and you dive deep into the sentences, you might actually get the meat of the program. And the meat is important to me because, one of the things that happens is as you grow older and your perception changes. You know how the book says, the way we have a change of perception is by repeated humiliations and the final crushing of our self-sufficiency. And I just want to promise you something that'll make you feel. I'm not a cheerleader, so you might not even feel good when you walk out of here. I'm not here to tell you everything's going to be. It's all going to be shit. You know what I mean? I'm just remember that. So when it gets shitty for you in 10 years or 15 years, I remember that asshole. He said to me it was going to get shitty, and I thought he was an idiot. This must be what he's talking about. Because when they say the way we grow up, the way we mature, the way we actually do the sixth step, where instead of just talking about God, we get real interested in the God thing. Because when it says this is the step that separates out the men from the boys, the grown-ups from the children. This is the serious stuff. This is the difference between 5 or 10 or 15 years sober and 40 years sober. You know what I mean? It's the difference because our disease is not the booze. The booze is a symptom of the disease. We got a lot of symptoms. There's a lot of guys I know that are alcoholics, and their symptom is they're chasing women all over the place, and they can't stop doing that because that's the central factor of their lives. There may even be women that are like that. I don't know. You know what I mean? But I'm saying we got a lot of symptoms. And those symptoms come out even if you're not drinking. You can be picking up a medallion and have those symptoms, and they can ruin your life. We have symptoms like fear, anxiety. You know what I mean? Feeling sorry for yourself. Self-pity is a symptom. It's part of the disease. The real disease centers in my mind, not my body. I had the real disease at 13 years old before I had my first drink. I had the disease all through the drinking. I stopped. You know why I drank? Because no woman, no car, no amount of money ever worked just quite as well, and this is important, quite as fast as just a few drinks. And so I drank it. If it worked for me today the way it worked for me when I was 20, I'd still be drinking it, but it stopped working for me. So I don't drink it anymore. The sad news about my life is that it stopped working for me 10 years before I realized it stopped working for me, and I hurt a lot of people. But I don't need alcohol to say bad things to people or hurt people or mess up their lives or be irresponsible. Most of the people I've hurt in my life through irresponsibility or just being mean or hateful or stuff like that, I've been stone cold sober. I've been as sober as I am right now, so I need that. That has something to do with my mind, the mind of an alcoholic. And so that's what I basically talk about. But one of the things I used to do is I used to follow people all around that was feeding me stuff they had never seen or heard before. That's sort of like, I was intrigued by, and these guys, they talk, it was like weird. They tell you about the third step, but they weren't really talking about the third step. They were talking about something that had something to do with the third step, but it was almost like a jigsaw puzzle. You had to put it together and figure it out. But the problem was, the reason I liked it is they'd be talking about stuff, and the problem is I'm like a tuning fork. They would be talking about stuff, and I would say, "That's me." I'm like that, but I didn't even know it's like. Sometimes you hear stuff, and you realize that's like you, and you didn't even know you had that. You didn't even know that was a problem. All of a sudden you see something yourself that you never saw before. It has nothing to do with drinking. It has to do with insanity. Because the whole thing is about, there's a connection between being insane and suffering and faith. There's a connection between all those, and I'll sort of like maybe get into it. I quote people from all over. I read the big book. I read 12 and 12. I read Talks about the good old timers. I read the Bible. I read whatever I got to read, and I listen to people. John Wayne. One of my favorite lines is from John Wayne. What's that line he has? He says, "Life is tough, and if you're stupid, it's even tougher." Did you know that? That's the truth. If you're stupid, your life will be real tough if you're not too bright. And I'm delusional. You know what the big book tells me? The big book tells me, I'm brilliant. I'm the smartest guy in the room. I don't have to listen to anybody. I'm in complete control. I know everything. Listen to me. You gotta listen to me. Nothing like that. Big book says I'm delusional. I want to think, well, I used to be delusional. When I was drinking, I was delusional. You know, that's what you're delusional for at least 10 or 15 or 20 years after you stop drinking. Maybe even at 40, I may be still a little delusional. It's possible. You know, I haven't stopped growing. I haven't stopped. So all 46 years means is that I've had 46 years of bumping my head against walls, 16, 20, 40 times, and finally realizing why I'm bouncing against the walls, because I heard somebody say something or something finally clicked. And then I say to myself, I got to stop banging against the wall. I got to stop doing this. And then 5 years later, I stopped doing it. You know what I mean? I don't know how that works, but you know, that's the deal. So, I mean, I just throw out what I got and what I've learned. And, you know, if it works, I was once talking to one of the attorney generals of the United States, and he was a Christian. I'm a Christian. And he was, you know, you don't have to worry. I'm not going to make you a Christian or anything like that, you know, wouldn't be a bad idea. But so I went up to him. And they were reading all that stuff. You know, Dr. Bob says, if you ever read Dr. Bob, I don't know when I started reading Dr. Bob, the Good Old Timers. I don't know when I started reading that book. It was one of the last books written in 1980, where I started reading what they were actually doing the first 5 or 6 years in it. You know, the Big Book says, have you ever read the Big Book where it says, we only have seen the person fail has thoroughly followed our path? That was written in 1939, the Big Book. That was written in 1939 in the Big Book. Rarely have we seen a person fail who has thoroughly followed our path. You ever wonder what the path was? It wasn't reading the Big Book. Does everybody understand that? In 1939, they wrote a book called the Big Book, which everybody in AA worships. And they say, rarely have we seen a person fail who has thoroughly followed our path. Their path was not reading the Big Book. Oh man, if you don't get that, you know, I mean, we're gonna have to have a long conversation because it wasn't written. The book stays on absolutely essential. 1 Corinthians 13, Sermon on the Mount, and the Book of James. If you ask Dr. Bob, would say all about it. He said it's all about the Holy Bible, the good book. If you ask him what's first things first, he'd say, "Seek ye first the kingdom of God and His righteousness, and all things will be added unto you." Everything was about the Bible. The whole thing was about the Bible. You know, now you wouldn't know that because it's been so pasteurized and homogenized and sanctified and sterilized that, you know, you could go in here and never even hear anybody talk about God or get anything serious about that, you know. But I mean, if you're really one of these people that want to do what they were doing, you're going to read Dr. Bob and the Good Old Timers. I don't know when I first started reading it, probably around 10 years sober, 11 or 12 years sober, when I was doing everything in AA, everything you're supposed to do, speaking at meetings, doing these step meetings, sponsoring everything that moves, you know, intergroup banquet chairman 2 years in a row, 8 years on relay calls and everything, doing everything you're supposed to do, and still scared, still not in control, still not going to, because the alcoholism will, because if you don't move on, if you rest on your laurels, and you don't move on, and there's a tendency for there is a tendency for everybody to rest on their laurels. You know why I know that? Because I believe the Big Book and the 12 and 12, and it says it's easy to rest on your laurels. It's easy to leave the God that you love. It's easy. It was easy for Bill Wilson. You know, one day he says, it's in Alcoholics Anonymous number 3. The Lord has been so wonderful to me, curing me of this terrible disease. I got to keep talking about him and telling other people. 2 minutes later, he's saying, but soon, his presence was blotted out by worldly clamors. And then a month after that, he's talking about Henrietta Seiberling and saying, I don't think we should talk too much about God. He's got a spiritual experience. He's blown away. He's talking about God. He's got to keep on talking about God. Then all of a sudden, somebody says something to him at a meeting, like you're killing newcomers or whatever the hell they were saying. Same stuff they say to you here. And then all of a sudden, he got scared that people wouldn't like him. You know what I mean? Because our whole life is whoring ourselves, being world whores to people and trying to conform to them instead of trying to do the God thing. And apparently there is one who has all power, and that's not me. I don't even have 5%. It's God. I mean, that's a sentence, by the way. You know, it's God. But if you're in God for popularity, Now, I know you guys wouldn't do that because I recognize you guys to be spiritual giants. But the bottom line is there are some people that will not move to the next level because they're worried that they'll be criticized. And worrying about being criticized and people not liking you is a worse bondage than drinking. Because you drink so that you'll feel comfortable with people. That's the reason why you drink. To feel comfortable with people, to have sex, to be able to ask a girl to dance. That's why you drink, because you're uncomfortable with people and you're restless, irritable, discontented. What difference does it make if you don't make the difference? What difference does it make if you stop drinking for 10 years and you're still uncomfortable in your skin? What difference does it make if you haven't been rocking in the fourth dimension of existence? You haven't experienced much of heaven. You don't know peace. What's that? That's living a life of quiet desperation. You know what I mean? So, but you don't know this because everybody comes to A for one reason, to stop drinking. As a matter of fact, they think once they stop drinking, everything's going to be okay. They don't come in, they don't arrest you for driving while feeling sorry for yourself. You come in and stop drinking. That's why you come into Alcoholics Anonymous. You're not looking to change, you know everything. You're not looking for people to tell you what to do. Alcoholics are defiant. That's a chief characteristic. They're delusional. We can't separate the truth from the false. Our alcoholic life, which means our thinking, seems comfortable to us. My sponsor says, why do you do the shit you do? Why do you say the stuff you say? I said, that's just my personality. He says, Russell, your personality is killing you. I'm a year sober. I haven't had a drink in a year. I'm doing all sorts of stuff in AA. He's now telling me my personality is killing me. How do you change your personality? Especially when you kind of like it. You know what I mean? It's the only one I've ever had. There's some people that like me. What do I change into? How can I be like why can't you be like your brother Gary? I don't know. How do you do Gary? I don't even know how to do that stuff. And so I come in here, and over a period of time, hopefully God does what he does. And every once in a while, you're doing great, and every once in a while, he just whacks you. He whacks you. And then he whacks you. And then he whacks you. You don't tell anybody he's waxing you. You don't tell your group you're being whacked when you have 2, 3, 4, 5 years because, well, not that you give a shit what they think about you, but you don't want to let them know that you're a thumb-sucking crybaby or something like that. And then the whacking gets so hard, you go up hopefully to somebody who actually knows what they're doing, and you say, he's whacking me. And they say, that's because you're stupid. You don't know it. They tell you you're stupid. They hit you over the head. Listen, that's what moves me. What moves me is people. I had sponsors that they refined alcoholic sarcasm to an art. Let me tell you something. I had a sponsor who once told me that his wife went to her psychiatrist. She said, my husband stopped drinking. This is the story. He says, my husband stopped drinking. And she said, really? He says, yeah, he's not drinking. He says, well, what happened? He says, he went to AA. He says, well, that's incredible. He says, and the psychiatrist says, does he have a sponsor? And he says, yeah, he has a sponsor. And he's obnoxious, And the psychiatrist said? He said, some people need obnoxious. There's a time for hugging, and there's a time for saying, why don't you fucking grow up? You're 40, 50 years old. Why are you running after every gal in the place like you're a 17-year-old spoiled brat? Sometimes people need to hear that. Sometimes they need confrontation. We got people that enable people because they're worried about they may not like them. They're all in Al-Anon. They're in another group. You know what I mean? It doesn't work. It doesn't work. There's so I don't know, somewhere along the line. So I needed to hear. I shadowed people with a lot of time, like people with 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years. I seek them out. I go, like you guys with Stephen, I'd go to the Stephen. Oh, Joe Snyder's speaking of this one, Eddie Edwards speaking of this one. I'd be running over, listening to those. I wanted to hear those people because I wanted what they had. Because that's the whole point. You got to want what somebody has and be willing to go to any length to get it. You may not even know what they have. You don't even know what you're chasing, but there's something about them. You want to be like that because if you have this disease, there's going to be a point in there may be a point, you may come a point in time, if you have a disease and you're sober 5, 10, 15 years, that you start realizing that you're crazy. Even without the belief. That there's something missing. but there's something missing. Like that guy said in Alcoholics number 3, I knew I was sober, but I knew I was missing something. There was something wrong. I knew I didn't have something. A sort of release, a happiness, or whatever it is there, and I didn't have that deal. You know, I was squirreling. I had one thought after another thought after another thought after another. I could not stop thinking. I could not stop thinking. You ever find yourself thinking a lot? You ever find yourself like anxious or depressed or worried or have anxiety? Have you ever noticed that whenever you have anxiety, have you guys ever noticed this? If you haven't, have you ever noticed that whenever you're anxious, there's always been a lot of thinking going on? Have you ever told yourself you got to stop thinking about something? Have you ever said, I got to stop thinking about this crap. I can't do anything. Have you ever said that? You ever wake up at night at 3 o'clock in the morning and say, I got to stop thinking about this thing? How's that working out for you? How's that working out for you? Have you sort of resigned yourself to the fact that you're always going to be like that? You can't stop thinking. You can't put your mind on hold or stop. You're no peace. You know? What if you ran into somebody in AA who could do that? Have a sort of inertia. You know, you just can't get a thought going. So you're just having so much fun sitting around staring at things. I don't know. It's possible to do so. I was talking to the Attorney General guy, and I said, because I was interested when, you know, I don't care who you are, what you are, if I can get something from you. And I was very interested because I walked up there, you know, he's in Washington, D.C., which is a crazy place. I said, how can you be a Christian in Washington, D.C.? You know what I mean? How can you do this thing in politics? And he said to me this, I got this from him. I think it applies to AA. He said, Russ, he said, I don't impose my faith on anyone. He said, that's not for me to do. As a matter of fact, my religion says don't do it. You know, you can't impose your faith. He says, but I have an obligation to expose it. And you know, like Big Book says, each alcoholic, when you give a talk, you know what you're supposed to talk about? Each alcoholic, in his own language, from his own point of view, talks about how he developed his relationship with God. That's what you're supposed to talk about. Then, you know, all the stuff they tell you don't talk about, that's what you're supposed to talk about. That's what they were doing in AA. You know, the first 5 years, you couldn't go to a meeting unless you got down in front of everybody in the group, and there were no white chips. You just got down before everybody in the group and gave your life to God. You know, that's all you did to get into AA, or else you couldn't go to the meeting. Now, you wouldn't know that unless you were Dr. Bob in the good old times. You might not know that from me, the big book, but that's what it did for the first 5 years. Rarely haven't seen a person feel it's thoroughly followed our path. So you didn't have a lot of people back then for the first 5 years saying, well, if they talked about God, I wouldn't have been there, because they wouldn't have been there. You know, they had already given their life to God in front of everybody, so nobody was putting down God, saying I'm a recovering Catholic, or whatever the heck that stuff is. You know what I mean? I'm not saying you're wrong or anything. That's what was going on. You're entitled to your own feelings. You're not entitled to your own facts. That's what was going on in this deal. And one of the things that happens is when you've been around for quite a long time, you know, and 40 years I think is a long time. I'm not bragging, I'm just reporting. One of the things that happens is you get approached by people that have 20 years. You know, the people that talk to me have 20 years. The people who call me up on the phone from all over, they have 25, 30, 35 years. And, you know, sometimes they call up, they say, I'm just checking in, or, you know, we have conversations, but, you know, many times I get calls from people that have problems, and they have troubles. And they're depressed, or something like that, just like Bill Wilson was at 23 years when he wrote The Next Frontier. And he made those statements. He says, I'm dying here. I'm dying here. You know, and I know a lot of other old-timers that are dying, that are going down the tubes. And I don't know what the problem is. And we wrote that, you ought to read that. You ought to read that stuff. You know, you like reading when he had 3.5 years? You ought to read what was going on with Billy when he had 23 years. And he says things like, I got it all wrong. You guys want to follow? Listen, I'm not putting him down. If he didn't want you to know this, he wouldn't have written it down. He says, I got it all wrong. He said, I put too much dependence on people, places, things, and on Alcoholics Anonymous. AA is not God. It's not a power greater than myself. Not the group, not the fellowship, not even the conference or any of that stuff. I put no dependence on God. I put all my dependence on AA, being the co-founder of AA, whatever it was, all AA. Not that AA doesn't work. Listen, you can stop drinking. AA will help you stop drinking. It'll be incredible. You'll stop drinking, and everything will be wonderful. Stopping drinking and picking up medallions. Every time you pick up a medallion, one of the things it says to you is you're doing great. That's what I was saying. You're doing great. You know, it's the best thing to work against humility. It's the best thing to work against humility is to think you're doing great because you are great. So Bill Wilson went up to Henrietta Sogling and said, we got to stop talking about God and religion. And you know what Henrietta said? He said, Bill, you got to stop worrying about what Alkies think or pleasing alcoholics. You better stop worrying about pleasing God. Because the only reason you're sober is because of God. And if you can't talk about God and what he's done for you at meetings, if you can't do that, you might as well be the Rotary Club. Because that's what separates us from the Rotary Club or some sort of club, you know? And then all of a sudden I read something in the big book. Here's a sentence for you. It says, we never apologize for God. All men of faith have courage. You want to get rid of fear? Did you know that all men of faith have courage? It doesn't say smart men have courage. It doesn't say brilliant men have courage. Handsome men, fat men, skinny men have courage. All men of faith have courage. They trust their God. And then it releases. It says we never apologize for God. We're never scared about that stuff. Instead, we let him demonstrate through our testimony what we tell people. You know, what he's done for us. At once, we begin to outgrow fear. You want to outgrow fear? You're going to have to learn how to talk about God. And if you're not talking about God because you're worried about what other people are going to think about you or say about you, then let me tell you something. If you're worried about talking about God in an A room where it's all over the wall and all over the textbooks, if you're worried about what some guy in the front row of an AA meeting is going to think about you, who's not even paying your visa bill, you know what I mean? You know what that is? That's fear of people and what they think about it. And you know, if you can't do it in an AA room, you're going to be a basket case out there in the real world. You know, you're going to be a basket case out there if you can't get rid of it. Because you know, if you think that you are what people think of you, you're really screwed up. And that's, you know what that is? That's alcoholism. If you think that you are your shoes or your clothes or your bank account or your car or your house or anything like that, or whether you're handsome or whether you're short or whether you're fat, then I'll tell you something. You know what that is? That's alcoholism. That's why you drank. To make believe you're Brad Pitt. You know what I mean? That's why you drank. To make believe you're Elizabeth Taylor. That's why you did that shit. That's the dis-ease. You know, the drinking goes away real fast. The disease, I don't know, 30, 40 years, something like that. I don't know how long it takes to get free of that stuff. You know, but there is one of us all power. That one's gone. I hate to say this, but you may find out. So if you read Dr. Bob the Good Old Timers, there's this line there where there was a guy named Clarence the Brewmaster, Clarence Snyder. He did the first AA group in where was it? In Cleveland. And by the way, you know what? You guys know what the first AA meeting? You know what they talked about? The very first AA meeting, Dr. Bob put his foot on the lung of a dining room chair and announced himself being alcohol and read the Sermon on the Mount. Read the Sermon on the Mount. Matthew 5, 6, and 7. That's the very first AA meeting. Apparently the conference hadn't met yet, so nobody there was there to tell him he was full of shit. You know? That's what Dr. Bob did. I started as a Bill Wilson guy, and I love Bill Wilson. He did a lot of things that was divinely inspired, but I ended up a Dr. Bob guy, especially after Dr. Bob's guy said to Bill Wilson, his last words said, Bill, let's not screw this thing up. Let's keep it simple. But so I was reading Dr. Bob and the Good Old Timers, and they have that whole line about how Dr. Bob's basically 12-step people. Of course, they didn't call it 12-step at the time. So he went to see Clarence in the hospital, and this is what Clarence said happened. Dr. Bob walked in. First thing he said to him, first question, do you believe in God? First question. You remember Dr. Young with Roland Hazard? He went to the treatment center, you know what I mean? And he got sober he was there for a year. A year! He said, now knowing the inner workings of my mind, drinking is impossible. A year. Then he went away, he started going home, and he hit Paris, and that was the end of that. He started drinking. Went up to Dr. Bob's. Went up to Dr. Young, one of the greatest psychiatrists at the time. You know? Can I get back into the treatment center? How many of you guys have been to more than one treatment? Can I get back in the treatment center? You know what Dr. Young said? Dr. Young said to him? He said, you have the mind of chronic alcohol. I've never been successful when that state of mind exists. He says, he said he felt the doors of hell just clanged on him. He says, is there no exception? Dr. Bob said, yeah, here and there once in a while. It's been going on for thousands of years. A person, he just changes. You know, one day he's drinking, he can't envision not drinking, next day he's not drinking. He changes. It's a phenomenon, it's a miracle, we can't explain it. He says, what do I gotta do? He says, it's all about God. Whole book, you know what they say in the big book? It says if a mere code of ethics or a better philosophy of life would have helped us, we'd have been sober a long time ago. But it didn't help us. None of that stuff helped us. You know, we had to find a power great in ourselves that would restore us to sanity, and the bottom line is stop us from drinking. You know, and he says that means, of course, we've got to talk about God. We've got to talk about God. That's what chapter agnostics is. As a matter of fact, they say agnosticism, atheism, that has to be abandoned. You know, has to be abandoned. That's what he said. That's what the book says. Okay? He says, you know, but we have a problem because agnostics hate that stuff. What if I told you we got about 90% of AA are agnostics? Okay, 70%. I just say shit like that to piss you off. You know what I mean? But if you took a sample of AA today, you'd probably find more people that don't really want to talk about God, or if they do want to talk about it, they're scared to talk about it. And you'd hear a whole bunch of people that say if you're in AA, you shouldn't do it. Because somehow they've managed to mold the traditions. Somehow they think what it says is we don't talk about God. And so they'll just beat the shit out of you over the head with the traditions or something. You know why? Because they've never gone to another level. Those are the guys I hear from when the dis-ease catches up to them at 20 years and they end up drinking again. Or when the dis-ease catches up to them at 25 or 30 years. It catches up. It'll catch up to you. It'll catch up to you. So what happened with me is because we're insane. We're insane. I'm so insane. My insane thing, I had a sponsor used to drill into me. He'd say, Russ, you're best thinking. Look, I was going for my PhD in algebraic topology. I became a lawyer. You're a division chief of the state attorney's office trying murder case. My sponsor was a used car salesman. You know, I was supposed to be sponsored by Albert Einstein or something. You know, what did I know? I had two neurons working when I came in. They were waving goodbye to each other. You know, I mean, I was gone. You know, I'm just a little better now. And, you know, he had me so convinced that I was crazy, and I believed it. And because I believed it, and because I wanted what he had, I wanted what the used car salesman had, and the people that were hanging around him, he had about 15 years, you know what? I respected him. And I loved him, and I knew he loved me, even though he would say, you know, I think I told you about this. I was in my office. I had about 20 diplomas, all sorts of stuff. I said, these are my degrees. He said, well, you know, Russ, rectal thermometers have a degree. You know the degrees. You know what they do with those. That's the way my sponsor talked to me. You know, I said to him, you know, it ain't 2 years. This isn't working. It ain't working. It ain't working. You know. He says, you must be one of the rare ones. I said, real one? He says, yeah. He said, you're a rare one. I said, rare one? What's a rare one? He says, well, they talk about it every meeting you go to. I said, I've never heard them talk about it. I was actually pleased because I've been telling them for 2 years that I was different and I was special. He said, oh, you're one of the rare ones. He says, like a diamond or something. I don't know. He says, yeah, they talk about his oil. He says, don't they say it every meeting you go to? Rarely have we seen a person feel who's thoroughly followed up path. You're doing everything. And it's not working, so you got to leave AA. AA is not for you. And I'm sitting there like somebody killed my puppy. He says, you don't have to leave, but don't tell me you're doing everything. You know, you haven't even done the 4th step yet. Stuff like that. So I have a guy. So listen, let me tell you about alcoholic insanity when you're 9 years sober. I'm 9 years sober. I'm sponsoring everything that moves. I've done all the stuff I'm telling you about, and I know how to do the 4 steps. You know, I don't have. Look, I'm not saying the steps aren't important. They're very important to know how to do the steps, to know the mechanics, to know the tools. Tools are supposed to get you to a certain point where you get beyond that deal. You get rocking in the 4th dimension of existence. And some people figure as long as they know how to do a good 4th step or a 10th step, they're going to be fine. They're the ones that call me up at 20 years and say, what's wrong with me? That's what happened to Bill Wilson. You become in love with everything AA, and you don't realize that AA was built on a superstructure that was around long before AA. Bob Smith knew about that deal, and so that's what happens. This thing will catch up to you, and there's a lot. I know you've heard the reason people drink is they leave meetings and stop going to meetings. You ever ask yourself what is a person who's around AA for 10 years and has heard a million times people leave because they stopped going to meetings? You ever wonder why a person with 5, 10, 15, 20 years going to meetings, hearing everything you've heard, stops going to meetings? You got to ask yourself that. Why do people stop going to meetings? And they say, I had 10 years and I'm coming back. I had 5 years and I'm coming back. Why does that happen? They've been given all the message. They know how to do a 4-step. There's something going on, and it has nothing to do with whether or not they know how to do a 4-step. Next time you're in an MRI machine and they're checking you out for the cancer, the radiation treatment, you tell them that what you need to do right now is a 4-step. See how that works out for you. Yeah, when he says you got stage 4 cancer, you just do a 4-step and it'll work out for you, Yeah, you're going to find out some shit as you grow up. You're going to find out some stuff. If you think that it's all about, you better learn how to do the steps. Or else you're not going to stop drinking. But I'll tell you something, there's something beyond that. The last chapter of the Big Book says, what does it say? It says something, the last page. It says, but we won't know you. Hey, forget about us. Your real reliance has to be on God. It's all through the book. That's the sentence. He will show you how to create the fellowship you crave. There's another fellowship. There's a fellowship you crave. Have you found the fellowship you crave? Have you found the person, your we, if you want, we have. Who's in your we? Who's the person that's talking to you that you're actually listening to and doing what they tell you to do even though you think it's stupid? If you don't have a person in your life telling you to do something you think is stupid, but you do it anyway because you respect them and you want what they have, you want something, you're heading down the wrong road. Because you know what that means? That means you're your sponsor. You know what I mean? And you ain't never going to do anything you don't want to do. And there are some things you may want to do that you need to have somebody kick your ass and doing it. I don't care if you got 46 years. I don't care if you got 24 years. That's the way it works. And so, that's that deal. So I got 9 years. I got a best friend who's got 11 years. His name is John. Great guy. John says to me, he says, why don't we meet at JJ's Diner and then we'll go to the Sunset Room afterwards and have dinner? I said, absolutely, brother. Another lawyer, good friend of mine, paratrooper, great guy, So I go to JJ's Diner. He's not there. I'm sober. I got 9 years. I'm sponsoring everything that moves. He's AA 11 years. He's doing, and he doesn't show up. I see him at the meetings. I said, John, how do you feel when you get stood up? Ever happen to you? You ever have anybody disappoint you? You ever disappoint anybody? So I said, John, I was at the thing, He says, oh, yeah, something came up. That's it. So he says, well, I'll tell you what, I'll meet you at JJ's tomorrow night and we'll go to the Carl Gaines group. I said, sure, absolutely. So I go to the JJ's. He's not there. I see him at Carl Gaines. I said, I was at JJ's. You were supposed to meet there. He said, oh, yeah, I had to do something else. So I think I'm starting to get a resentment. I can't remember whether I did 4-step or not, but I'm getting a little pissed off. So he says to me, look, tomorrow night I'll meet you there and we'll go to the Homestead Group or something like that. And I say, okay, now don't get ahead of me here. So I go there, he doesn't show up. I go, he doesn't show up. I'm 9 years sober. I'm not a kid. I'm 9 years sober. I'm like 1 year away from double digit. You know what I mean? When you're really cured, And so the bottom line is so I go, he says, oh yeah, something came up. So I go up to a friend of mine named Dane Carell, has 42 years. This is a 42-year problem. I got to get somebody else time, and say, because I'm pissed, and I tell him everything I just told you. I probably added some stuff because I wasn't under a time constraint. The poor guy had to sit through 15 minutes and then he did this and then he did that. And what's wrong with this guy? And he said, are you done? He says, yeah. And then he spent 15 minutes beating the living shit out of him because he wanted to know why I showed up the second time. What would you have done? So I said, oh, well, I'll meet you tomorrow. He wanted to know why I showed up the second time. Now, here's an interesting thing. I was going to 3 meetings a day for like 10 years or something, 9 years. I was doing all the steps. I knew all the steps. And he said, why did you show up? He wanted to know why I showed up the second time. Now you're going to like this one. And I didn't have a clue. Forget about the third time. He wanted to know the second. He says, why do we show up for people who are not sober and emotionally unavailable? Well, thank you. You know why? And I didn't know. You know why? Because I was still delusional at 9 years. There was a whole lot of shit that I didn't know about myself, that I couldn't see, that I didn't even know I had the problem. And then after he beat me up for 15 minutes, I said, well, what about John? I said, well, he's not sober. I said, he's got 11 years. He says, he's not sober. Sober people don't do that. Sober people don't gossip about people behind their back. Sober people show up. Sober people don't do that. So, no, he's sober. And 3 years later, John was drinking. And I found out, I picked him up and I found out that he had been taking Xanax because he went to a doctor. Even though I had 11 years, and the doctor said, I know what your problem is. Try some of these, and he's taking Xanax. And then he drank. And he wasn't sober during that period of time. I didn't know that, but Dan Carell knew it. You understand? Because he knew stuff I didn't know. And so the bottom line is this, make it real fast because I have 3 minutes. I can wrap it up in 3 minutes. The 7th step says humility is the basis of all our steps. Every one of the steps, humility, whatever that is. He says unless somebody has a little humility, just a little humility, he's never going to overcome drinking. Unless he gets more of that precious quality, he will never be happy. You know how you get humility? Through repeated humiliations and repeated humiliations and the question of our self-sufficiency. So somehow, in some way, our insanity leads us to get hurt over a period of time, and as we get hurt, we go through suffering. And one of the things it says in the Big Book is we refuse to understand the value of suffering. It's also in the Bible. It says we go through trials and tribulations. Every time we get, why are you here? You're here because there was a time in your life where things got so bad, you decided to come to Alcoholics Anonymous, and then you got better, and that's the problem. My sponsor used to say the problem with alcoholics is they get too well too fast. And the great news about me is I was never really able to get too well. You know what I mean? And even when I was able to get too well, where I start resting on my laurels and say, look at me, I got 9 years. Look at me, I'm speaking again. Look at me, I'm doing this. Something would always come around where I'd meet somebody with more time or something I want what I had, where I'd be struggling, and I'd have to ask questions, and I'd have to ask. I never got so well that I didn't have somebody in my life where I was involving around and asking them questions and listening to their bullshit and taking what they said to me. And you know what happened is I respected them and I did it. And I did what they told me to do, whatever it was. I didn't want to do it. One day I had 10 years and I was feeling kind of crappy like Bill Wilson was. I went up to some guy and I told him all my problems and everything like that. And I'm doing the steps, I'm doing everything. I'm stepping over here. He says, you need to get more into God. You ought to go to a Bible study. I said, no, I'm spiritual, not religious. No, I'm an AA. Religion is bad. I'm not, don't look at me. I'm a spiritual guy. You know what I mean? I've evolved into a spiritual. He says, well, you do whatever you want to do. You're the one with the problem. But the one thing you're lacking is God is not the central fact of your life. And I seem to remember they said that somewhere in one of our literature. It says that's a great fact, that God has become the central fact in your life, and you're convinced that He lives in your heart and mind the way you can be miraculous. Doing for you what you can't do for yourself. And that's the key to being rocking in the fourth dimension of existence. It's the great fact exists and nothing less. And he had quoted that to me, and I didn't know what it meant because I never looked at the sentences. I always looked at the appendix too. I always listened to the guy who said you don't have to do that stuff. It's bullshit. You know what I mean? I had a fellowship telling me one thing. I had a big book telling me another thing. And that's when I started reading Dr. Bob and the Good Old Timers and discovering what they said was going on. And the next week I wound myself in a Bible study. And now God's the central fact of my life. And all of a sudden shit started really happening for me. So listen, I told you I'm just going to tell you straight. That's the deal. I don't care whether you do it or not. I don't get money for it. Nobody says they get $100 for this guy like this. I'm just going to tell you what the deal is. So you get on your knees, you do the third step. You know what I mean? You get off your knees, and then you check your bank account. You check, or you get on the scale. You know what I mean? It lasts like that. It's good to do it. You know what I mean? But unless somehow you don't go further with it, you're going to be like Bill Wilson. Worldly clouders are going to block him out of your life. He's not going to be the center of that. Thank you. That's all I have to say.
Recovery inspiration is sitting right there waiting for you. Rocketed.org AA speaker recordings brings real voices and real stories straight to your ears. Subscribe now so you never miss a new recording dropping. Keep that motivation on tap and help spread the word. Hit subscribe and let recovery find you every single day.